Unified growth theory is resolving the mystery of growth. It allows us to understand why it took 300,000-year period to reach this critical threshold beyond which the environment changed so rapidly so as to generate demand for human capital, a massive fertility decline, freeing the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population, and moving the world into the modern growth regime.
A seguir, uma conversa com o Dr. Oded Galor. O Dr. Galor é um dos pensadores mais proeminentes e visionários da atualidade, com reconhecimento e notoriedade mundial. Com frequência, mais recentemente, o seu nome voltou a constar na lista de indicados ao Prêmio Nobel de Economia. Oded Galor é o criador da Teoria Unificada do Crescimento Económico, cuja proposta almeja um entendimento macro-histórico da humanidade e respectivas causas de impulsionamento e desenvolvimento económico, geração de riqueza, prosperidade e desigualdade. Oded Galor é economista, tem dupla nacionalidade, israelense e norte-americana, é professor de economia da cátedra Herbert H. Goldberger na Brown University em Providence, Rhode Island, palestrante requisitado e exímio pesquisador, pioneiro na sua área. Oded é membro eleito estrangeiro da Academia Europa, é membro eleito Fellow da Econometric Society e Fellow do Departamento de Economia da Hebrew University. É o editor-chefe do Journal of Economic Growth, editor do Journal of Population Economics e co-editor do Macroeconomic Dynamics, todos veículos peer-reviewed de estudo e pesquisa académica e científica. O Dr. Oded Galor é também autor do livro best-seller internacional e traduzido para mais de 30 idiomas, A Jornada da Humanidade, As Origens da Riqueza e da Desigualdade, publicado no Brasil pela editora Intrínseca. O seu livro oferece solução ao que é considerado como sendo dois dos mistérios mais complexos da humanidade. O primeiro, porque os humanos são a única espécie que escapou da armadilha da subsistência e dos braços do polvo malthusiano. E o segundo, porque o processo de crescimento e desenvolvimento da humanidade progrediu de forma desigual mundo afora. Uma leitura fascinante, fluida, A Jornada da Humanidade é um livro relevante e inspirador. Conta a nossa história e lembra-nos da extraordinária capacidade de adaptação humana. Lembra-nos de forma otimista e racional quem somos e para onde vamos juntos como sociedade e civilização. Por meio do livro A Jornada da Humanidade, compreendemos as forças que talharam a história e que hoje esboçam o nosso futuro. Este é o Cabral Podcast, sejam bem-vindos e agora, meus caros, deixo-vos com o Dr. Oded Galor.
Dr. Oded Galor, thank you so much for being here with us today. We truly, truly appreciate your company, your availability. You're talking to us directly from Providence, I understand, Brown University, where you teach. So we're very, very pleased to have you here with us today, sir.
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be on your show.
Great. Sir, to start, I really want to just say a few things as an introduction, which I think is just so valuable. When you talk about human development, human or civilizational development, when you talk about wealth generation, when you talk about human capital, economic development, when you talk about inequality, nations' ability to generate wealth, the transfer of wealth from generation to generation. It's just incredible what you've done in Journey of Humanity. I have here the Portuguese version, Jornada da Humanidade, portanto, as origens da riqueza e da desigualdade. So, the human journey with regards to the generation of wealth, it's just so well depicted, described, represented in your book. Your research does a phenomenal job in unifying all these things, all these factors, all these variables, and through a unified growth theory, sort of like distill all of this and tell us our own story of development, our own story of wealth, our own history, civilizational history. So again, I'll just like to congratulate you for a phenomenal achievement. This book is a hit worldwide. Your work is obviously very well represented in the Research Economic Academy and just at all scientific levels. Your contributions are tremendous, and we truly, truly thank you to be here today, and just such a tremendous pleasure to have you here with us today. And to start our conversation, I really wanted to start with asking you kindly to sort of talk about your unified growth theory. Could you give us a soundbite, sort of like a context on your unified growth theory, please?
Absolutely. So first, thank you very much for this kind introduction to my work and to my recent book, The Journey of Humanity. I'm delighted that it had an impact on the Brazilian audience, and naturally that's part of the goal here, to spread the gospel and to assure that, in fact, the insights of the book can be applied worldwide so as to generate development and so as to generate a reduction in inequality, both within and across nations. So broadly speaking, unified growth theory is an attempt to understand the process of development in its entirety. Namely, rather than focusing on economic development in the modern era, or rather than thinking about economic development in the past, this is an attempt to understand the process of development in its entirety. And it is based on the conviction and based on empirical evidence that a significant portion of the inequality, as we see it across the globe today, is originated in forces that operated in the distant past, forces that were formed hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and even tens of thousands of years ago. And as a result of it, if we would like to understand economic development today, if we would like to decipher the roots of inequality as we see it today, we have to focus on these elements that operated in the distant past and their impact on economic development today. So unlike conventional growth theory that focus only on the modern growth regime, and to a large extent abstracted entirely from the forces that brought about the transition from stagnation to growth, the forces that brought about much of the inequality across the globe, I'm focusing on the roots of inequality as we see today and trace them, and trace these roots to forces that operated in the distant past. So unified growth theory is a grand theory that tries to uncover the wheels of change, if you wish, that operated in the course of human history and propelled humanity in the way that history unfolded, namely moving from the Stone Age into the modern growth regime in which we enjoy tremendous amount of wealth, but at the same time, there is great amount of inequality across the globe.
Wonderful, indeed. And it's while during, obviously reading your book, you just explain it in such a clear and accessible fashion, jargon-free, and it's just incredible how you transport us to that process, that journey of wealth generation. I would like to start or to further develop or dissect the unified growth theory, talking about the Malthusianism or the Malthusian trap. If you could briefly contextualize the Malthusian trap, and because that sort of sets the stage for your thesis development in your book. So could you just expand a little bit on that, and then we'll sort of
Absolutely.
as you go.
Absolutely. So before delving into the Malthusian trap per se, I should just emphasize the fact that The Journey of Humanity, the book that I have written, is an attempt to decipher two of the most fundamental mysteries that surround the journey of humanity. One of them is the mystery of growth, namely the dramatic transformation in living standards that occurred in the past 200 years after literally hundreds of thousands of years of stagnation, namely the 14-fold increase in income per capita in the world as a whole in the past 200 years after near stagnation for 300,000 year period. And the second mystery is the mystery of inequality, namely the roots of the vast inequality in the wealth of nations. Why some countries are poor and others are rich, and why inequality increased so dramatically in the past 200 years. Now, in the context of unified growth theory, as I said before, I discover that a significant portion of the inequality as we see it across the globe today is originated in forces that operate in the distant past. These are forces that operated in what you defined as the Malthusian epoch. So when we think about the process of development, one can segment the process of development into three fundamental phases: the Malthusian epoch, the post-Malthusian regime, and the modern growth regime in which we reside today. But interestingly enough, it is the Malthusian epoch in which much of the forces that ultimately brought about the prosperity today operated. This is a time period that is characterized by fascinating dualism. On the one hand, stagnation in income per capita. Income per capita was fluctuating over this time period around the subsistence level. But at the same time, this is a period that is characterized by some dynamism. Dynamism in the context of technology, dynamism in the context of population, and dynamism in the context of human adaptation. And it is this dynamism that ultimately rescue humanity from this Malthusian trap. So let me be clear, what is the origin, or what are the sources of this Malthusian trap? So as I said, 99.9% of human existence is taking place in the Malthusian epoch. And during this time period, there is some technological progress. It is not as pronounced as it is today, but it takes place. And when technological progress takes place, when people discover different cultivation methods, better seeds, etc., we see an enlargement in the resources that individuals have. In today's world, this enlargement of resources will generate greater prosperity. But in the past, this permitted families to have more surviving children. More of their children survive. Many more of them were born, and as a result of it, the progress that was made in terms of technology was offset entirely by proportionate increase in the scale of the population. So during this time period, when technology advanced by, say, 10%, population increased by 10%, and as a result of it, there was no change in the material well-being of the population. So for a long period of time, we see this Malthusian fluctuation. Technology arrives, increases income per capita temporarily, but then population is adjusting proportionately, and income per capita is reverting back to the previous equilibrium position. And this lasted over 300,000-year period. But as I said, at the same time, despite this stagnation in living standards, we see great dynamism in the context of the scale of the human population, in the context of the level of the technology that humans are using, and in the context of human adaptation. If we think about humanity in Africa 300,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens is emerging, naturally individuals are using a very elementary technology. They use stone tools. But 300,000 years later, in the eve of the Industrial Revolution, they have in their possession a new technology, a steam engine technology. So over these 300 years of stagnation, technology is evolving gradually from stone tool technology to steam engine technologies. Another important element is the scale of the human population. The size of the human population in the eve of the agricultural revolution, 12,000 years ago, is only about 2.5 million. The size of the human population at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution is nearly 1 billion people. Namely, despite the stagnation in living standards, These fluctuations and these technological advances are permitting the scale of the human population to increase 400-fold. And it is the scale of the human population, technological progress, and the adaptation of humanity to the environment that is ultimately bringing about technological progress that is rapid enough so as to rescue humanity, as I will explain later, from this Malthusian trap.
Wonderful. Excellent explanation. Thank you for that. In your book, you actually state for our readers or your readers, you state an example which is, rather ludic, but it's so prevalent, whereas you illustrate just that. You talk about the Kellys, you talk about the Jones family, and you talk about the Olsons. And indeed, you managed to, let's just say, characterize three profiles, rather distinct profiles in your book with regards to how a particular family will relate to wealth, to opportunity. For example, the Kellys were essentially a subsistence family. Everyone worked, everyone was fully dedicated to agriculture. And indeed, their view was, in typical Malthusian, viewpoint, their view was whatever we generate in terms of wealth is dedicated towards to birth rate, let's just say, to have more children. And the more children that you have, the more labor or access to greater labor force in terms of working on the field and therefore producing. But then you get sort of like addicted to that particular phenomena, whereas, your children will consume your overflow, or let's just say your overproduction will be consumed by the growth or the size of your family. And that's just a very interesting case because you put it in such a family dynamics that it's so easy to understand because, it's sort of interesting because that characterized nations throughout our early development prior to the Industrial Revolution. On the other end, you have the Jones, and the Jones also had that particular view, but they invested in education. So they actually worked the land, but there was one of their sons that actually went out and got an education. And then you have the Olsons that, actually were invested in human capital, early forms of human capital. They believed in education. And it's so interesting when you see those three profiles, because that sort of depicts our early history prior to the Industrial Revolution, during and post-Industrial Revolution. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think that's, yes, this was precisely the purpose of this description. And indeed, it illustrates quite nicely the family dynamics that operated over this time period and how resources were spent differentially in different stages of development. So as you said, when we think about Ireland, and we think about the Kellys in this particular case, this is a time period in which families are operating very close to the subsistence, and therefore, when, say, the potato is being introduced into Ireland, and as a result of it, there is great amount of increase in the amount of calories that people can consume. These calories are simply converted into more children for the Kelly, and ultimately the amount of calories per person remain unchanged. But later on, as in fact economic development is changing gradually, then these resources are shifting gradually towards investment in human capital. And as families are investing more and more in the quality of each of their children, in the education of each of their children, it comes on the account of the number of children. And this is a force to a large extent that liberates the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population.
Wonderful. As you put it in your book, the Malthusian octopus, right? So you start to free yourself, nations start to free themselves from the Malthusian octopus. So, that's an interesting parallel, and that's so well, explained throughout the book, whereas you have economic development tied in human civilizational development and human capital. And obviously, when you look at that particular phenomenon, and then when you bring in the Industrial Revolution, we have all these ideas about the Industrial Revolution and what it did in terms of automation, but you offer a few very interesting viewpoints with regards to the industrial, or particularly the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, how we enter the Industrial Revolution with very little human capital. And obviously the lack of human capital and the lack of education or qualification in the workforce led to cost of opportunities, or in this sense, less productivity. And then eventually we see a curve where technological development offers greater investments in human capital and education. And that sort of retro element, feeds back into the economic development. So I wanted you to sort of, talk a little bit about that, because it's just a fascinating sort of connection.
Indeed. So the main question, the most fundamental question and the most difficult element to solve in the context of the understanding of the journey of humanity is how, in fact, humanity at last is able to break free from the long arms of the Malthusian octopus. What precisely happens in the course of industrialization that permits suddenly humanity to break free from the Malthusian trap? And what I argue in the journey of humanity and in unified growth theory is that there are certain wheels of change that are rotating in the course of human history. And this is the technological progress, the scale of the human population, and technological and human adaptation. Now, if we take two of them, the scale of the human population and technological progress. So as I said, 300,000 years ago, technological progress is very, very slow, and technology is very, very rudimentary. But nevertheless, technological progress is occurring steadily, and every wave of technology is permitting larger population to be sustained. But larger population implies that we have greater supply of potential innovators. And these innovators are bringing the next wave of technology that, again, will expand resources and will support more population. And as a result of it, in the course of human history, we see this reinforcing interaction between the scale of the human population and technological progress. More people, more advanced technology. More advanced technology, more people that are being supported. And over this 300,000-year period, we see these wheels of change rotating at an ever-increasing pace. But nevertheless, it is always the case over this 300,000-year period that when technology advances, population advances proportionately, and as a result of it, income per capita remains flat in the long run. But ultimately, inevitably, the pace of technological progress becomes so rapid that the technological landscape is changing so rapidly that education becomes essential for people in order to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment. And as a result of it, responsible parents start to invest in the education of their children. But these parents are living very close to the subsistence. In order to invest in the education of their children, they have to economize on other elements in their budget constraint. They cannot economize on their own consumption because they live very close to the subsistence. And as a result of it, they're forced to economize on the number of children. So it is the demand for human capital, the demand for education that occurs in the course of industrialization that is liberating the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population. As I said, the wheels of change are rotating and rotating without any impact. But suddenly, we pass a critical threshold beyond which education becomes essential in order to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment. At this moment, parents start to invest in the education of their children. It comes on the account of the number of children, and for the first time in human history, this mechanical link between technological progress and population growth is being broken. Technological progress is advancing without the counterbalancing effect of population, and the world is being freed from the counterbalancing effect of population and is sailing into the modern growth regime. This would allow humanity to escape from the Malthusian trap, this reinforcing interaction, reaching a critical point beyond which education becomes essential. And to a large extent in the book, I'm presenting a metaphor that can help the reader conceptualize this idea. And this is the metaphor of the transition, or phase transition from water to gas. And I'm basically referring the reader to a daily experience that we all have, which is basically boiling water in order to make our favorable coffee or tea in the morning. And what we see in this process is that initially when we place a kettle with water on the stove, there is very little motion. At a certain point, there is a motion, but there is no phase transition. It takes a certain water temperature to change the nature of, or the phase of this liquid, and basically generating the transition from liquid to gas. Similarly, we see the same process in the context of human history. Technology is advancing and is advancing and advancing, corresponding to water temperature that are rising and rising and rising without an effect. But then, once a tipping point is being reached, in the context of water temperature, 100 degrees Celsius, in the context of human history, sufficiently rapid technological progress in the course of industrialization, something is happening. Technology is stimulating investment in education, fertility starts to drop, and as a result of it, the world is free from the counterbalancing effect of population.
Wonderful. You, in your book, you illustrate all of that with various examples. There's one particular data point that I would like to share here, which I thought it was so important. And this is just one. Everything that you just talked about, you not only introduce from a theoretical standpoint, but you also provide with data and you share studies and so forth. And there's a particular data point that's fascinating, whereas you associated the deployment of steam engine machines in departements in France with the investment in education, investment in qualification of the workforce, investment in human capital. And this is just one example of how you so masterfully sort of connect all these things, all these factors, and you sort of weave your unified growth theory under the Journey of Humanity book, okay? So congratulations for that. It's just an incredible exposition. I would like to segue on some of the things that you talked about and focus particularly on human capital. Claudia Golden talked about, or she referred to the 20th century. She's an American historian, and she referred to the 20th century as the human capital century. You state that in your book. And in my opinion, that sort of just encapsulates very nicely what we just talked about. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. So indeed, human capital, or education more specifically, is really critical for the understanding of the transition from stagnation to growth. It is the investment in human capital. It is the investment in the quality of children that is liberating the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population, propelling technological progress without the counterbalancing effect of population. So certainly, human capital is essential for the understanding of the journey of humanity, is critical for the resolution of what I defined initially as the mystery of growth, this tremendous transformation in living standards that occurred in the past 200 years after 300,000 years of stagnation.
Wonderful. we spoke about the Industrial Revolution. We spoke about human capital, technological development, population growth, how innovation and technology sort of enables us to free ourselves from the long arms of the Malthusian octopus. I wanted to talk about capitalism, and I wanted you to kindly ask you to connect capitalism with the Industrial Revolution as per your book.
Right. So there are different ways in which we can tie this transition and emergence of the modern growth regime to the notion of capitalism. And so naturally, the market economy, the incentive of individuals to operate in order to fulfill their own independent goals are very important in assuring that critical elements in the course of the journey of humanity are operating properly. First, as we said before, at a certain point, education becomes essential. And when education becomes essential, education naturally is not a free good necessarily, and there are too many poor people in society to invest in education, in the sense that we are in a juncture where the demand for education is enormous, but at the same time, significant portion of the human population is unable to invest properly in education due to the fact that they have limited resources and due to the fact that public education is not in fact in place. And one thing that I emphasize greatly in the book is the fact that in the course of industrialization, it is in fact the capitalist that realize at a certain point that their livelihood depend on the education of their labor force. So we see that in fact, it is the industrialist that lobby intensely in the British Parliament to provide education, compulsory and free education to the masses, so as to be able to compete with continental Europe's in industrial technologies and more broadly. So the argument that they raise is that there is great amount of complementarity between technology and human capital, and this complementarity is being enhanced, but at the same time, capitalists themselves cannot educate the labor force, because if you will educate your own labor force, people after receiving the education can basically cross the street and be employed in a nearby firm, and as a result of it, your investment will be lost. And as a result of it, they call the British Parliament at the time to enact, as I said, education reforms, and ultimately they're very successful. We see the education reform in Britain in 1870 and the Balfour Act in 1902, in which education becomes compulsory and free. And as a result of it, this feedback between technological progress, human capital formation, and the emergence of sustained economic growth is being enabled. So it is in fact capitalism that is standing behind this process in many different dimensions. It is in fact capitalism that is assuring that investment in education will take place even among individuals that do not have the resources to properly invest in education.
Phenomenal. Considering that and looking at capitalism's viewpoint, where, or just, from the approach of the triple bottom line principle, whereas you have people, profit, and planet, or even thinking about, Milton Friedman's The Business of Business is Business, and sort of like looking at ESG. Could you sort of connect all these more modern concepts with the early signs that we saw, or measures that we saw being taken at the early industrial revolution processes that you've just stated?
Right. So what we see in the context of industrialization is a gradual process in which entrepreneurs and business owners are basically taking the role of promoting and generating the incentive for technological progress. And this naturally propel technology and propel the growth process. And at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, they are taking the role to assure that there is the proper complementarity in the production process between technology and education. And when this complementarity is being implemented and is being in place, in fact, the growth process is being enhanced. So when we think about capitalism, it has many different dimensions. Naturally, it is about financial institutions that permit the growth process to move more smoothly. It is about political institutions that protect property rights. It is about cultural elements that are permitting the growth process and entrepreneurial activities to be part of the way that society is viewing the world. And all these elements are basically combined at this point in time to propel humanity and to permit a transition from stagnation to growth.
Wonderful. So, we could just say that sort of summing up our, the last few minutes, whereas we talked about the Industrial Revolution and economic development and capitalism and human capital. And we briefly talked about some of the more modern concepts with regards to ESG and triple bottom line. Can we just say that, and you've said this prior in this conversation, innovation, knowledge, education, work qualification, human capital, these are substantial factors that characterize and drive the modern era.
Absolutely. I would place a little more emphasis on human capital as opposed to physical capital. I think it is, in fact, human capital that, as I said earlier, is the critical factor that is generating the transition. To a large extent, physical capital is a byproduct of the process. It's not the trigger of the process. Once firms are being developed, naturally, physical capital, financial institutions are very important in order to smooth the operation of these firms. But what is really critical in the development of the modern world is human capital. I would say, yes, technology, free enterprise, human capital, fertility decline, and to some extent, physical capital as well. Although, as I said, physical capital is not the trigger. Physical capital is accompanying the process. Without physical capital, the process would have been significantly slower. So the presence of physical capital, the presence of financial institutions permit the process to become faster than otherwise, but it is not the fundamental element that propel the growth process from stagnation to growth.
Very well. When we looked at Malthus and Malthusianism, there was this idea that we just wouldn't have enough food to nourish the world and to sort of like accompany what would eventually was the view of a growing, world population. We've seen that through the employment of and development of innovation and technology and investments in human capital. We've seen that that's not the case, right? We're actually, for example, if we look in the 80s, at the early 80s, we had 40% of the world's population, and we will clock just about 5 billion. So we had 40%, that's substantial, of the world's population was subsiding in poverty conditions. Let's just say that they had access to less than $1.90 a day. Today we have north of 8 billion folks worldwide, and we're down to a little bit under 10%. We have just about 700 million folks that live in similar conditions. So this is really a true example of what you just so clearly state in your book. Here we have an increasing world's population, and we don't have nearly or close to 40% of the world's population is not subsiding in, let's just say, poverty conditions. We made some significant strides if we just look at more of our recent history, looking from the 1980s now till 2024. Would you agree with that? I mean, that's just sort of like a very good depiction of what you so clearly state in your book.
Indeed. So it is, in fact, technological progress and the expansion of resources that permit us to sustain an incredibly large population. And in this respect, I mean, there is a certain interesting and ironic element. You think about public discussion in the 1960s, the 1970s, even the 1980s. The main fear at the time is that, in fact, we are facing a population boom that cannot be sustained. There was a real fear that, in fact, hunger will emerge in the world and we will not be able to sustain the human population. Ultimately, in the course of the Green Revolution, we see that many of the largest countries in the world in terms of population became self-sufficient in production of food. And of course, the issue of hunger never emerged in a tangible way. But ironically, today, in fact, if anything, people are very concerned about the reverse process. They refer to population collapse and they refer to societal collapse. Now the concern is not about overpopulation. The concern at the moment is about a decline in population below replacement and whether, in fact, we can sustain economic activity, whether we can sustain technological progress, whether we can support the older generation with an increasingly smaller fraction of the younger population in the economy. So there is this tremendous transformation in the anxieties in the world, from basically anxiety about the inability of planet Earth to sustain the human population into an anxiety that perhaps we have too small of a population so as to sustain the current economic activities.
Indeed. And obviously the Green Revolution is a direct byproduct of technological development. So whether we're talking about better seeds, as you stated earlier in the conversation, or just machinery and other things that eventually enhanced food production. And I would like to share a particular example that you state in your book, which I think is so apropos as we're talking about innovation and the Green Revolution. You actually depict an ad from a tractor manufacturer in your book, a 1921 ad from a manufacturing company. And I'll read here, I'll try to translate as I read to English. But this sort of really encapsulates what we just talked about. And, just so folks know, this is an ad from a tractor manufacturer. And basically what the ad conveys is a clear message, whereas, buy our tractor, because if you buy the tractor, you're able to release your children so they can go to school. And you don't feel a decrease in production or productivity because the tractor compensates for all of that. And it's just incredible. I mean, this was in 1921. So we're talking about a little bit over 100 years ago, but so much has changed, and the role of innovation and technological development, it's sort of just so well represented in this ad, in my opinion. And just a few sentences here, which I marked. And basically, as I translate, leave the tractor, take the place of your son in the field. You will never regret none of these investments. And basically the ad just has 3-4 paragraphs. And basically, they're trying to address or convince the local farmer to invest in human capital. That's exactly what we talked about before. Release their children, let your children go to school. So you have more of a qualified workforce. And in a sense, you have already a little bit of the Jones that you depict, the Jones family that you depict here in your book, we have a little bit of the Olsons as well. And it's just so phenomenal to see this transformation. Would you agree with that? So
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I think that it's fascinating, and I think that it's exemplifying very well this time period in which, in fact, technology was complementing human capital. At the same time, technology was making child labor unprofitable. And so it really exemplifies the trade-offs of the period, and in fact, how technology ultimately liberating children from the need to operate in the fields and to support the production process of their children. And now at the same time, technology created the incentive for parents to invest in the education of their children so as to permit them to be more flexible, more adaptable, and more able to work in the modern world and with modern technologies.
wonderful, great. Oded, I wanted you to talk about the entrepreneurial spirit. Okay, obviously, as a professor of economics at Brown University, as a researcher, the contributions that you make worldwide, your book, how do you see, or what's the importance of the entrepreneurial spirit? You also, talk about this in the book, whereas you make a connection with the Enlightenment age, and the importance of innovation and human capital, knowledge, and how that sort of like promotes the entrepreneurial spirit. Would you like to make that connection for us?
Right. So, so what I argue in the context of the book, The Journey of Humanity, is that beyond these two elements, two wheels of change that we explored quite extensively, the scale of the human population and technological progress, there is an additional wheel of change that I call human adaptation. And human adaptation is to a large extent the ability of humanity, the ability of individuals to operate in a changing technological environment. So initially, this adaptation was partly biological. People adapted to the environment in which they operated, and as a result of it, they could benefit better from the food supply that existed, for instance, in the context of the emergence of lactose tolerance. But to a large extent, when I refer to human adaptation, I refer to certain changes, cultural changes that are occurring in society, and as a result of it is making the society more adaptable to the technological environment that is taking place. And one of, the key elements, the key cultural elements that are emerging in the course of human history are, first, future-oriented mindset, namely the ability of people to look into the future and to have the proper planning horizon that will ultimately allow them to invest properly and to reap the benefits of this investment. Another important element in this dimension is what you mentioned, which is entrepreneurial spirit. And this combination of future-oriented mindset and entrepreneurial spirit are critical in driving the process of innovations, in implementing certain production plans that are based on rewards that will occur in the future. And ultimately, they are critical, as I said, in the ability of societies to be rescued from the Malthusian trap and moving into the modern growth regime. And this is partly, when you think about, say, the period of enlightenment. The period of enlightenment is symbolizing this transition from backward-looking humanity into forward-looking humanity, into humanity that trusts itself in its ability to shape nature rather than to take nature as given. And again, shaping nature requires an entrepreneurial spirit. Shaping nature requires future-oriented mindset. So when we reach this critical juncture, and this occurs, as I said, in the eve of industrialization, and ultimately it is becoming more and more prevalent as we move into today's society, entrepreneurial spirit, future-oriented mindset are operating jointly so as to shape the society and the environment in which we operate.
Wonderful. Well, just a word from, or a sentence from Kant, Immanuel Kant, sapere aude, right? So dare to know. It's sort of like so interestingly encapsulates or defines that particular period. Wonderfully put. Oded, I wanted to talk about, we're just about the end of our conversation here. I wanted to close with a few thoughts on the Malthusian trap, and how did Europe and the Western world escape the Malthusian trap? And what about the rest of the world? We're here in Brazil, so let's just focus on Latin America or the global South. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Right. So as I said at the outset, I mean, there are two fundamental mysteries that are resolved in the context of my book, The Journey of Humanity. The first one is the mystery of growth. And to a large extent, unified growth theory is resolving the mystery of growth. It allows us to understand why it took 300,000-year period to reach this critical threshold beyond which the environment changed so rapidly so as to generate demand for human capital, a massive fertility decline, freeing the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population, and moving the world into the modern growth regime. But at the time of the takeoff, when the takeoff is taking place, it takes place in different time periods across the globe. Some societies are taking off at the beginning of the 19th century and even earlier, others only very recently. And since this takeoff is associated with a 14-fold increase in living standards, an incredible inequality is emerging across the globe. Those societies that are taking off from the Malthusian epoch at the beginning of the 19th century are magnifying the inequality as we see it across the globe. And the question is, of course, what permitted, say, Western Europe and the offshoots in North America to take off early, and what ultimately trapped other societies, say, the society in the global South, for a prolonged period of time. And as I said before, when we think about the process of development and the wheels of change, they're rotating in any corner of planet Earth, whether it is Western Europe or whether this is in the global South. But it is rotating in a differential pace. Part of it is simply based on a geographical lottery. Some societies were simply blessed to be positioned in a place where the environment was conducive for a future-oriented mindset. The environment was conducive for political competition. And as a result of it, the cultural traits that emerge in these places, the institutions that emerge in these places, and the degree of diversity that emerge in these places was conducive for development. So when we think about Western Europe, and we ask ourselves, why Western Europe rather than China? There are a few possible explanations. It will not be the cultural factor, because future-oriented mindset is very similar in China and in Western Europe. But institutions differ tremendously, and human diversity differs significantly. China is much more homogeneous. Homogeneity is very important in generating social cohesiveness. And as long as technology is not operating very, very rapidly, social cohesiveness is conducive for development. So when we think about the world in the Middle Ages, when we think about the world in the year 1000, China is dominating the world technologically and otherwise. Why? Because at the time, innovations are relatively slow, and cohesiveness, homogeneity, is beneficial in terms of generating a society that can produce and operate efficiently. On the other hand, Europe is a crossroad of civilizations, many different nations, conflicts across nations, and as a result of it, great amount of diversity, but lack of homogeneity that prevents the cohesiveness that is so important. So in the Middle Ages, so in the year 1000, China is dominating the world. But nevertheless, in the eve of industrialization, it is in fact Europe that is in a better position to take off. Why? One of the explanations that I'm advancing is that Europe has the cultural fluidity to adopt different ideas. So the ideas that are associated with enlightenment, the ideas that are associated with the scientific revolution that are ultimately become very profitable. They're generating political competition. They're generating institutions that are more inclusive. They're generating cultural traits that are more forward-looking. And as a result of it, they permit Europe to take off earlier than China. But more broadly, in the context of the global South, one has to look at the individual characteristics in each location. If we think about Latin America, some Latin American societies, such as Brazil, are quite diverse. Naturally, people are coming from very diverse backgrounds. Others are relatively homogeneous. And homogeneity, as I said before, is a dead end because it does generate social cohesiveness, but it comes on the account of innovativeness. We need cross-fertilization of ideas. In order to be innovative, societies that are overly homogeneous will not perform very well in this respect. But naturally, the global South is very involved. We think about Brazil, I would attribute a sort of delay in economic progress in Brazil predominantly to geographical endowments that led into extractive institutions and ultimately institutions that were not conducive to economic development as opposed to diversity or elements along these lines. So again, the explanation will differ across societies. Broadly speaking, what we can say is that proper amount of diversity that balances between the benefits of cross-fertilization of ideas versus social cohesiveness, inclusive institutions that are byproduct of the geographical endowments, namely having geographical landscape that is not necessarily conducive for large plantations, and as a result of it is not very conducive necessarily for the emergence of large landowners class that is ultimately implementing extractive institutions. These are elements that can explain part of the uneven development across the globe.
Very well. Thank you for that explanation. That's very powerful and very insightful.
So just one element in this respect, I mean, so I basically attribute uneven development across the globe to four fundamental elements. The lottery of nature, namely whether geography was conducive for development. Second, population diversity, whether in fact nature again allowed the society to be properly diverse for economic development. And as I said, this changes in the course of development. Cultural elements that are conducive for future-oriented mindset and planning and entrepreneurial activities, and of course, institutions, extractive institutions versus inclusive institutions that are again based on the type of geography that existed in each location.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for mentioning institutions. You talk about it in your book, how particularly colonized nations, the importance of institutions and whereby, for example, North American colonies versus South American colonies, the importance of institutions and how some of the native societies adhered to the institutions of the colonizer, or if there was some hierarch sort of social elite that implemented certain institutions or certain values, and you depict that, you represent that as factors that could potentially influence wealth generation, human capital, economic development. Am I correct with that?
Indeed, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. So institutions are naturally critically important, but it's important to note the institutions, as you just suggested, are not manna from heaven. It is rarely the case that sort of institutions are sort of exogenously imposed in different locations. Typically, institutions evolve as a byproduct of the process of development, and as a result of it, some geographical endowment was conducive for the emergence of extractive institutions. Some geographical endowments, the one that exists in Western Europe, being fractionalized geographically, was conducive for the emergence of inclusive institutions, political competition, and ultimately this legacy of geography and its reflection in institutions had a long-lasting effect on comparative economic development.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Oded, I wanted to read a few lines here from your epilogue, right on from your book. And I think it's just a very nice way to end our conversation. I still have one last rapid fire question, but I'd like to read, if you don't mind, just your closing statement here on your right from your epilogue. And I'll translate dynamically here from Portuguese to English. So you say that my hope is that comprehension about the origins of wealth and global inequality will guide us through the development of policies that facilitate prosperity all across the world. And that by this process, or as a result of this process, our readers may see and fight for a future that's even more so generous, a future that's to come, as our human species continues its journey through uncharted territories. And I just think that it's such a strong statement or closing words for Journey of Humanity, because you really depict throughout the book, you draw this journey path of wealth generation and progress and innovation. And you close your book with words of encouragement, words of hope, words of belief in human nature, inherent good. And that's just so important for us readers and truly our community to grasp that from you and really internalize that particular message in such a human or humane like fashion. So I thank you for those wonderful, for that wonderful closing statement, and thank you for your wonderful book. Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. One last question. If you could define in one sentence or two sentences, what is the best book or your favorite book, or what is it that could potentially, or what's important when you're reading a book? What's so important in a book that makes it special for you? And what is it that you look for when you read a book?
Well, so it depends. I mean, so naturally, one is to distinguish between novels and nonfiction. In the context of novels, naturally, it's something that is touching your soul in a very fundamental fashion, something that connects you to the writer in a special way. In my particular case, I mean, if I think about my youth and beyond, I was touched very deeply by Dostoevsky, and somehow perhaps it's my personality, my introverted personality, that connected with perhaps Dostoevsky's personality that made this special connection. So this is in the context of novels. But naturally, you're more interested in, I suppose, in nonfiction. And in the context of nonfiction, I think that, I mean, for me, it's really, I would like to be exposed to something that will enable me to resolve the puzzle, the big puzzle, who we are, what is the purpose of life, where are we heading from here forward. So again, it's not an accident that I sort of was behind unified growth theory, because it was sort of my quest to have a resolution, an understanding of the entire picture. Now, the unified growth theory is an understanding of the entire picture in the context of the journey of humanity. It's not necessarily an understanding of the personal journey of us as humans. And in this respect, I'm intrigued usually by elements that can help me understand why are we here, what is the goal, and where are we heading. And so this is what I typically seek when I read a book. But the more modest goal, as I said, will be some sort of a very broad, deep understanding of the processes in which we are part of. And in addition, I tend to be, as you suggested earlier, an optimist. Not a naive optimist, I think a rational optimist. And in this respect, I would like somehow to see people that are not projecting the journey of humanity or the future of humanity in a very dismal fashion. I think it's probably not a realistic projection of humanity. If I think about the journey of humanity, what is really striking about the journey of humanity is our resilience. I mean, the fact that we exist as a species for 300,000 years, and we managed to overcome many tragedies, many hurdles, and somehow it appears that the journey is really untouched by it. I mean, if I would have basically to project the trajectory was not affected, and we didn't deviate from this long-term projection. So as I said, back to your question, I would like to see books that are sort of are giving me a sense of understanding of who we are, where are we heading to, but at the same time that are what I would call rationally optimist.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Your book does not only inspire, but it does represent humanity in a very rational, optimistic fashion. You never discount humanity, and I thank you for that, because you really managed to illustrate the opportunity in terms of journey and path. Obviously, while illustrating the opportunity, you very clearly state the risks. You clearly mention some of the things that when we look back, certain things that are sensitive, child labor, gender inequality, but at the end of the day, you're focusing on the achievement, on the overarching goal of success, human development, civilizational development. And that's exactly why I wanted to end this conversation with those words right from your epilogue, because it just translates exactly that, relates exactly that to our reader, or to the readers, and to whoever is going to, hear and see our conversation. So I thank you greatly for that. And I don't know if there's any last thought that you'd like to share with us, or a particular source of information or information regarding your work that you'd like to point us to. But here's your book. I understand that you also have the Unified Growth Theory release book that you published in 2011. If there's any other information, perhaps about your future work or current work that you'd like to share with us, that would be great.
At the moment, but I really want to thank you for a wonderful conversation. It was really fantastic to talk to you. I mean, your knowledge is quite impressive, and it was fantastic to have our conversation.
Thank you so much, sir. Truly appreciate it. Much success. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and hope to see you soon. Thank you. Appreciate it.
My own pleasure.
Para fechamento e reflexão, faço questão de vos deixar com algumas informações. O Banco Mundial define capital humano como a riqueza incorporada no ser humano, composto pela soma de suas habilidades, conhecimento, qualificações, expertises e comportamentos. Esta instituição, vinculado ao seu Programa de Aceleração e Incentivo Global de Investimentos em Capital Humano, elabora o Índice de Capital Humano com a sigla ICH. O índice revela a capacidade dos países estimularem e mobilizarem o potencial económico da sua população. O ICH varia entre 0 e 1. O 1 indica potencial máximo a atingir. A apuração mais recente consta no relatório Human Capital Country Brief de 2023. Entre outros atores, o relatório identificou o Reino Unido com ICH de 0,78, os Estados Unidos com 0,70, a Argentina e o Uruguai com 0,60, o Paraguai com 0,53 e o Brasil com 0,55. A China teve o seu ICH apurado a 0,65 e a Rússia a 0,68. Continuando, no Brasil, um estudo da FGV, publicado em 2024, indica que o capital humano cresceu 2,2% ao ano entre 1995 e 2023. A pesquisa elaborou o primeiro índice de capital humano oficial do país, abrangendo um longo período de tempo e, dessa forma, contextualizado para a realidade social, económica e política brasileira. O estudo adianta que o fator de crescimento de ICH de 2,2% ao ano foi o principal responsável pelo crescimento do PIB do país. O capital humano influencia a produtividade, lucro, crescimento económico e desenvolvimento social, humano e desenvolvimento civilizacional. Empodera as pessoas a realizar o seu potencial social e económico. Sem dúvida, tal como o Dr. Oded Galor mencionou durante a nossa conversa, o capital humano é essencial para o entendimento da jornada da humanidade. Antes de fechar, Thomas Robert Malthus, em 1798, identificou que realmente o crescimento da população aumentava numa curva não linear, potencialmente até exponencial, enquanto a curva de produção e de abastecimento de alimentos e de outros recursos apresentava um comportamento linear, o que eventualmente condenaria a humanidade à denominada armadilha malthusiana, presa em declínio, com falta de alimentos, mergulhada na subsistência e na escassez, a humanidade viveria na pobreza, com uma qualidade de vida dismal. Na história moderna, verificamos que a humanidade escapou dessa lei, dessa armadilha inevitável de Malthus. De certa forma, na atualidade, podemos dizer que nos livramos dessa ansiedade. No entanto, outra ansiedade espreita, a ameaça do cenário contrário, ou seja, de uma população que cresce a percentuais que não permitem a sua substituição. Esse cenário também assusta. Relatório do Pew Research Center de 2019 informa que a população mundial tem um crescimento projetado de até 10,9 bilhões no ano de 2100. O percentual de crescimento anual é projetado de 0,10%, sendo que de 1950 até 2019 o percentual de crescimento populacional mundial foi de 1 a 2% ao ano. A diferença projetada de crescimento rumo ao século XXII é gritante. O mesmo relatório indica que é esperado que a região da América Latina e do Caribe, até 2100, tenha uma população mais envelhecida em comparação com o resto do mundo. Para efeito de comparação, a mesma região em 1950 apontava uma idade mediana da população de 20 anos de idade. Em 2100, espera-se que a idade mediana nos países da América Latina e Caribe seja de 49 anos de idade, mais do que o dobro de 1950.